If you see yourself in the woods, run. The reason you'll never take my son camping again. Jake, my 11-year-old son, blindsided me one day when he asked if we could go camping. I nearly spit out my lukewarm coffee in Surpresethis was coming, from the same kid who complained about the sun's brightness at soccer practice and whined about mosquitoes at night. So when he suddenly expressed interest in camping, I couldn't help but chuckle. It was such a far cry from his usual pastime of being glued to anything with a screen. We were hanging out by my truck one morning, talking about school, when Jake first mentioned camping. He nudged a pebble along the dry road, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Hey Dad," he began hesitantly, "think we could go camping sometime?" I couldn't help but grin from ear to ear. Apparently Jake's friend Daniel had been endlessly bragging about a camping trip he went on with his dad, making the great outdoors suddenly irresistible to my screen-obsessed son. "Camping? Huh," I said, trying to contain my excitement. "Sounds great, but you know, it's not all fireflies and s'mores. There's bugs, for one thing. Lots of them." Jake grimaced, his enthusiasm briefly dimming. "Yeah, I know," he mumbled, kicking at the dirt with his sneakers. I gave him a playful nudge. "If the weather holds, maybe we can just find a good spot by the lake next weekend. Just you and me. You up for it, yeah?" Jake said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. His response to the lake idea didn't seem genuine. A subtle shrug and a glimmer of disappointment in his eyes revealed his desire for a more immersive experiencing that involved tents, campfires, and a genuine escape into nature. Merely visiting the lake wouldn't cut it. Only a true camping trip would satisfy him. Truth be told, I hadn't been camping in years. Fond memories of childhood fishing trips and backyard campouts with my own dad felt like a lifetime ago. Work had a way of taking over, and lately, it had been consuming more than its fair share. But after listening to Jake's retelling of Danielle's camping trip story, it had stirred something in me, friendly rivalry. I was suddenly determined to one-up Daniel and his dad, to make sure my boat had the camping trip of a lifetime. A grin spread wide across my face as I promised Jake, "Yeah, you know what, Jake? We're gonna go camping, and it's going to be the best camping trip ever. As soon as I can take a break from work, we'll go." Jake's excitement was contagious. He jumped up and down with Joe, and I couldn't help but laugh. It hit me then that I probably should have introduced him to camping sooner. "Thank you, Dad," he shouted, his voice ringing with gratitude. "Thank you, Dad. Thank you." I gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "All right, champ, let's simmer down a bit," I chuckled. "Head inside, and get started on your homework. We don't want Mom holding this over our heads," I added with a wink. Jake nodded eagerly and practically skipped into the house, leaving me with a warm sense of fatherly pride. The weeks flew by, and I finally managed to snag some time off work. In the evenings, I'd pore over articles and videos on wilderness survival and the delicate art of s'more making. My childhood camping memories were more fuzzy nostalgia than concrete know-how, and I couldn't let my lack of experience show, not in front of Jake, and certainly not in front of that Daniel. Meanwhile, my ever-supportive wife, Sarah, decided to forego the mosquitoes and campfire smoke for the comfort of our home. She said it was girl time with a good book and a long bath, while I couldn't help but sense a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Traitor," I jokingly teased, reminding her of our grand mission to outshine Daniel and his dad's camping trip. She'd just laugh and say, "Go conquer the wilderness, honey. I'll be here holding down the fort." It was true that Sarah wasn't exactly an outdoors enthusiast. She enjoyed a leisurely stroll in the park, but multi-day camping trips weren't her cup of tea. Still, I knew she secretly loved seeing Jake can be Bond, and deep down, I hoped this man versus wild adventure might reignite my own forgotten love for the outdoors. My mission? Mastering the art of building a fire that wouldn't leave us all choking on smoke, identifying constellations for Jake, hoping I wouldn't mix up Orion with the Big Dipper, and maybe even catching a fish or two, although, based on my past fishing experiences, that might be the biggest challenge of all. It was time to put my crash course in wilderness survival to the test, and create an unforgettable camping trip for Jackione that even Daniel and his dad couldn't top. At last, the weekend we'd been waiting for arrived. That Friday, as I picked Jake up from school, excitement buzzed through the car as we pulled into the driveway. The moment we stepped through the front door, Jake's eyes widened in amazement at the sight of the camping gear I had meticulously, or so I thought, laid out for him like a treasure trove for an intrepid explorer. The living room had transformed into a chaotic staging ground for our trip. A giant, green tent bag rested at his feet, while two mismatched sleeping bags in a vivid orange. The other in subdued camouflage leaned precariously against the table. Beside two overstuffed backpacks, I'd proudly displayed a bounty of rations, mostly marshmallows, chocolate bars, and enough instant ramen to feed a small army. "Ready to conquer the wild with me?" I asked. Jake didn't disappoint. His eyes sparkled with an unspoken thrill that seemed to shout, "I can't wait to tell Daniel I went camping too." With the car packed to the brim and threatening to keel over at any sharp turn, Sarah pulled me aside just before we left. Her usually bright and playful eyes held a seriousness that cut through my usual humor. "Please, be careful out there," she said, her voice tinged with worry. I knew this wasn't the moment for jokes. Squeezing her hand, I gave her a reassuring nod. "We'll be fine," I promised, hoping my confident smile would hide any lingering anxieties, but my own lack of camping expertise. Jake and I settled into the car, the engine rumbling with the promise of adventure. Determined to make Daniel and his dad's Crystal Lake camping trip look like a backyard picnic, I'd scoured maps and forums for the perfect spot. Jake had mentioned that Daniel and his father had gone camping at the Crystal Lake campgrounds, conveniently close to our town. Crystal Lake, I teased, as if it were the last place any self-respecting outdoorsman would pitch a tent. "We're going somewhere way better," I added with a wink. Our destination was Whisperwood Forest, a hidden camping ground 3 hours north. As the miles stretched before us, Jake peppered me with questions, his enthusiasm keeping the energy high. "Are there bears in Whisperwood?" he asked, eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. "Maybe," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant, though a flicker of unease ran through my forums did mention some black bear sightings. "But that's why we have all this camping gear, right? To be prepared for anything." Jake's questions ranged from the practical "will there be a bathroom?" to the fantastical "do you think we'll see Bigfoot?" By the time the landscape outside our window blurred into a patchwork of greens and browns, his voice had grown hoarse, and a peaceful silence settled over the car. We veered off the main road, following the rhythm of a narrow dirt path snaking through the dense forest. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy overhead, casting long, dancing shadows on the dusty track. The air hung heavy with the earthy scent of damp moss and decaying leaves, punctuated by the occasional chirp of an unseen bird. With every bend and dip, the car swayed alongside us, its tires crunching on loose gravel. I caught a glimpse of Jake in the rearview mirror, his head bobbing with every bump, his eyes wide with anticipation and fixed on the passing scenery. After about 20 minutes, we emerged into a small clearing, the sudden brightness of unfiltered sunlight momentarily blinding me. As my eyes adjusted, I took in the scene. The clearing was modest in size, about the size of a tennis court. In its center stood a gnarled oak, its branches reaching out like skeletal arms. An eerie silence enveloped the area, interrupted only by the rustle of leaves in the still air. I brought the car to a gentle stop, the engine sighing softly as it died. Jake's eyes sparkled with anticipation as he looked over at me. "Ready?" I asked, my voice echoing in the sudden stillness. His nod was eager and swift. As I stepped out, my joints popped like distant firecrackers. I retrieved our backpacks from the trunk and hoisted the tent onto my shoulder, its weight familiar and grounding. I let Jake take the lead as we scouted for a camping spot. I knew it was important for him to feel like the captain of our adventure, the leader of our expedition. Watching his determined strides and furrowed brow as he surveyed the land like a seasoned explorer was hilarious. Eventually, he found a suitable spot, or rather my son did, tucked away from the car and hidden by thick underbrush. Sunlight danced through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on a carpet of moss and ferns. Nearby a crystal-clear stream burbled, its melody harmonizing with the chirping symphony of unseen insects. It was a secluded paradise, the perfect refuge for me and my son, nestled away from the world within the forest's embrace. With a proud grin, Jake declared our campsite found. While he scampered off to explore the nearby stream, I tackled the seemingly straightforward task of pitching the tent. However, the instructions were akin to cryptic hieroglyphs filled with diagrams, resembling abstract art and terminology. I would challenge even a seasoned scholar. 20 minutes later, after much head-scratching and muttered curses, the tent stood albeit with a noticeable lean to one side. "Behold," I announced, trying to hide the beads of sweat gathering on my forehead. Jake, ever the diplomat, simply grinned. "Coolest tent ever, Dad." As one rolled our sleeping bags inside the tent, I sent Jake on a mission to gather sticks for our fire. He scampered off into the undergrowth while I patrolled the edge of the woods, collecting stray logs to bolster our firewood stash. Out of the corner of my eye, thought I saw a figure peeking from behind a tree, but dismissed it as a trick of the fading light. Igniting a fire, often portrayed in movies with a single dramatic swipe of a flint, turned into a comedic ballet of fumbled matches and stubborn kindling. My attempts at channeling my inner caveman were met with sputtering defiance from the damp sticks. After 20 minutes of frustration, I surrendered to the ease of modern technology and pulled a lighter from my backpack. As if sensing my defeat, the fire roared to life with a satisfying crackle. I called Jake back and together we roasted marshmallows under the shifting hues of the evening sky. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with fiery shades of orange and red, we shared stories and laughter, leaving behind the worries of city life for the simple joy of being together in the wild. As the clock neared 9 p.m., exhaustion settled over us like a warm blanket. Jake, his eyelids drooping like weighted curtains, readily agreed it was bedtime. I subdued the fire with a few nudges from my boot, but instead of fading completely, the embers seemed to pulse with an unnatural inner light, casting dancing shadows across the forest floor. The usual nighttime sounds of crickets and rustling leaves took on an unsettling tone. A distant howl pierced the silence, long and mournful, similar to an owl's call, yet somehow different from any I'd heard before. A chill ran down my spine, prompting me to pull Jake closer and tuck him snugly into his sleeping bag. "Just a no, champ," I reassured him, trying to sound confident despite my unease. My voice echoed strangely inside the tent, adding to the eerie atmosphere, but Jake, already drifting off to sleep, remained unfazed. Before I knew it, my eyes had closed, and I'd drifted off. It felt like no time had passed before a soft nudge at my shoulder stirred me awake. Squinting in the dark, I made out Jake sitting bolt upright looking at me. "What's wrong?" I mumbled, my voice heavy with sleep. "Shh," he whispered, his voice trembling. "There's something outside." Half asleep, I assured him it was probably just a squirrel or a similar creature and encouraged him to try and sleep. I turned onto my side, seeking the comforting embrace of sleep once more. But before it could claim me again, I heard a sequence of sounds distinct from the forest's usual symphony. Footsteps, deliberate and measured footsteps, circled our tent. These weren't the light steps of a deer or the clumsy thudding of a bear. There was no natural rhythm to them, no telltale snap of a twig. They were silent, calculated movements. 2 steps, a pause, 2 more steps, a pause, as if whatever lurked outside was deliberately trying to be quiet. 2 minutes stretched into an eternity before the pattern resumed. 2 deliberate steps, a pause, and then 2 more steps. Wiping the sleep from my eyes, I propped myself up. A glance at Jake confirmed he was still awake, his eyes wide with terror. In a hushed tone, I promised to investigate. He gave a small nod, and with a deep breath, I inched forward, my hand trembling as I unzipped the tent just a crack. Tearing through the gap, I found the darkness outside, impenetrable, the only light source being the faint embers of our extinguished campfire. Squinting, I strained to see beyond the flickering red glow. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw a figure near the tree line, a subtle shift in the shadows that seemed to move on silent feet. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving me questioning my tired sanity. Turning back to Jake, I forced a reassuring smile. "Everything's okay, champ. Go back to sleep." Whatever lurked outside wasn't any creature I recognized, and it showed no signs of leaving. As we settled back into our sleeping bags, a sudden noise shattered the silence, jolting me awake. It wasn't the familiar rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. This was a sharp crack, a deep, resonant snap of a fallen branch weighing too close for comfort. A cold sweat instantly coated my skin. Whatever had caused that sound was heavy. Quietly, I rose from my sleeping bag, the tent floor feeling small and exposed beneath me. Retrieving my flashlight, I unzipped the tent fully with deliberate care. The chilly night air rushed in, stealing my breath momentarily. With trembling hands, I switched on the flashlight and swept its beam across the surrounding woods. The once familiar trees now loomed ominously in the darkness. Shadows danced and twisted in the flickering light, playing tricks on my already rattled mind. I scanned the forest floor for any sign of the creature, a footprint, a snapped twig, but found nothing. Yet, just beyond the flashlight's reach, a glimmer caught my eye, subtle movement, a flash of reflection. I focused the beam in that direction, my heart pounding, but saw only the swaying branches of a nearby pine. Convinced the source of the noise was ahead of me, I had turned away from the tent. However, the sound of leaves crunching behind me shattered that assumption. Whirling around, I aimed the flashlight toward the tent, partially illuminating my son, who sat upright, with a confused expression. Whatever had made the noise remained out of sight. I had almost convinced myself it was merely a curious animal nosing around behind our tent. Just as I was about to dismiss the fear and retreat into the safety of the tent, ready to label the sounds as harmless, the source of the noise revealed itself, a moment that stretched my sanity thin. It stood up from behind the opposite end of the tent, where it had been hiding. Me, standing over the tent, partially bathed in the weak glow of my flashlight. It defied all logic and reason. Even as I stared directly at it, my mind struggled to accept what my eyes were seeing. It wasn't an animal, as I had initially assumed. It was me. I found myself locked in a gaze with myself. It had my face, but it wasn't me. Its limbs extended from misaligned joints at the shoulders, longer and more spindly than mine. Though humanoid in shape, its proportions were wrong, its limbs extending at unnatural angles. Clad in tattered clothes akin to my camping attire, its body seemed like a grotesque mirror image of my own. The most unsettling part was its face. It mirrored mine in almost every detail, save for the eye spots of absolute blackness in place of my familiar brown eyes. When caught in the beam of my flashlight, those eyes revealed twin spakes of light, within the darkness, staring back at me with an unnerving intensity. A single glance revealed its formidable strength, far surpassing my own. Its arms, thick with sinewy muscle, bore the unmistakable markings of a life lived in the wilderness. These were not the sculpted muscles of a gym-goer, but the rugged strength forged by the trials of nature itself. Mountains climbed, rivers crossed, battles waged against the elements. As its mouth contorted grotesquely across its face, the skin splitting like parched earth. A wet tearing filled the night air, an agonizing sound that sent a primal scream echoing through my mind. The chill of the night was now a distant memory, replaced by a fear so profound it threatened to immobilize me. Suddenly, a voice pierced the silence, a small, vulnerable voice belonging to Jake, calling out from within the tent, asking if I could see anything. At the sound of his voice, the creature's attention shifted sharply toward the tent. It leaned in, drawn by Jake's innocence. Its already unnaturally wide mouth stretched further, the lower jaw unhinging to an impossible length, revealing a menacing row of needle-like teeth. The thing raised its elongated arm, which moved unnervingly stiff and jerky, like the movements of someone who hadn't felt flesh beneath their fingertips for years. I could see each joint crackle and pop as it extended its arm. I was confused as to what it was doing, but then realization hit me. Instinct took over. I plunged my hands into the tent, grabbing Jake, and yanked him out with all my strength. Yanking him from the tent, we stumbled out, the ground a sickening blur beneath my feet. We landed in a heap, the sound of ripping fabric filling the air as the creature tore through the tent like a child ripping through tissue paper. The metallic tang of blood, sharp and acrid, filled my nostrils. I covered Jake's mouth with my hand, feeling his tears against my skin. We lay there in silence, watching the thing eviscerate our tent. Amidst the chaos, my bag was flung towards us. Recognizing it, I rummaged through it until my fingers closed around the car keys. Leaning close to Jake, I told him when I gave the signal, I wanted him to run for the car. In the tense silence that followed the creature's assault, a distant noise momentarily captured its attention. Seizing the opportunity, I whispered to Jake, "Run." We sprang up and bolted towards the car, the creature's piercing shriek chasing us from behind. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I pushed on, fueled by a primal urge to protect my son. Reaching the car, I fumbled with the keys, the creature's rasping breaths hot on my neck. With a satisfying click, the door unlocked. We tumbled inside, slamming the doors shut just as the creature lunged forward, its fingers scraping against the metal. With trembling hands, I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. In the dim light, I could see the creature standing mere inches from the car, its grotesque smile contorted in what seemed to be frustration. With a surge of adrenaline, I shifted into reverse, then spun the car around, tires churning the earth as we sped down the trail. We didn't stop until we got home. Throughout the drive, Jake remained silent, his soft sobs a stark contrast to my own stifled emotions. That night marked the end of our camping trips. It doesn't look like he'll be beating Daniel and his dad's camping trip anytime soon. Stories number 2. Don't eat at the diner called Happy's Restaurant. They serve absolutely delicious human meat. I lost my job a couple months ago, and the entire business I worked for abruptly went bankrupt and shut down. To make ends meet, I started driving for Uber late into the night. It was about 3:30 or 4 a.m. when I made the last drop-off on the night it happened. The passenger was a strange, quiet man with a greasy t-shirt. His brown eyes looked flat and dead. I glanced into the rearview mirror as I dropped him off at a Victorian house in the middle of nowhere, making sure he left my car so he could wander off and wear a mask made of human skin or whatever people like that did on their days off. The house looked like something from a horror movie, all sharp turrets and dark windows with a blood-red exterior. Dawn came early that day, a cancerous orange sky looming overhead. Needles of rain abruptly started falling sideways. Tired and hungry, I kept an eye out for somewhere to stop and eat as I drove through the filthy torrents of rain. I turned on the GPS for my apartment and sped through the dirty, empty streets of Frost Hollow. Dark, dead trees rose overhead on both sides of me. I drove on for a few minutes, seeing only a single house far back at the beginning of the road that entire time. I didn't know this area, so I was pleasantly surprised when a brightly lit diner appeared on my left. A blinking sign cheerily read Happy's Restaurant. The parking lot was entirely empty except for a truck that looked like it had been there for weeks. Leaves and dirt covered its windshield, and someone had written "Clean Me" in the grime in giant letters. I heaved a deep yawn as I pulled into the parking lot. I tried to check my phone, but there was no internet or service all the way out here. I hoped they had Wi-Fi in the diner. Happy's Restaurant had enormous plate glass windows wrapping around the sides and front of the restaurant. Light burst out onto the dark parking lot in harsh white streams as birds chirped in the forests around me, waking up to the new dawn. The architecture of the place looked straight out of the 1950s. I could imagine James Dean going there and chain-smoking cigarettes over a burger and a coffee. I got out of the car, heading over to the front of the restaurant, where I lit a cigarette and inhaled deeply. The spicy menthol tobacco gave me a sudden jolt of energy. Blinking quickly, I smoked the cigarette as quickly as I could, feeling wide awake by the end of it. I stood under the canopy of the building, watching lightning erupt like missile flashes across the sky. The street remained dead and empty. I hadn't seen a single other person since I had dropped off the weirdo at the nearby Victorian house. I opened the glass door of the diner, hearing a bell ring overhead. I looked into the empty restaurant, seeing its sparkling clean tables. The smell of fresh coffee rose out in fragrant waves. Shrugging, I went down and sat at a table next to a TV in the corner. It was playing some local news channel. Two patients of the Grey Path Psychiatric Hospital were able to break out by taking a nurse hostage. They had apparently planned the attack for weeks, making homemade knives out of screws taken out of the walls and other contraband that went undetected. The nurse escaped soon after, uninjured but in clear distress. The facility is considered a maximum security hospital, with the majority of patients considered criminally insane and held until, "Hey, sorry bud, didn't see you there," a voice called out from the back of the empty restaurant. I jumped, turning to see who was speaking. A man came out in a streaked, dirty apron. He was incredibly fat, probably at least 300 or 400 pounds. For greasy chins hung down on his neck like the wattles of a rooster. He reminded me of a circus freak, a slug-like man whose heavy footsteps shook the ground as he approached my table. He had red hands like a butcher. His face, too, was betrayed and covered in sweat with a tiny nose in the middle and giant, rubbery lips. His name tag said, "Frank." "Morning," he mumbled. "What can I get for you?" "Our waiter never showed up, so I'm the only guy here. I'll have to take your order and cook it, if that's okay." I nodded happily. "Yeah, that's fine. I just want a coffee with extra cream and sugar and a Reuben with fries and an extra side of coleslaw." He wrote it down on a dirt streak tat he pulled from his apron, taking a very long time, and writing as slowly as possible. I watched his face closely. He reminded me of a clown, but his eyes were gray, the color of steel. They seemed freezing cold, almost inhuman. There was nothing clownish about them. "Okay. But that'll be right up," he said, grinning down at me. His yellowed teeth were covered in a thick layer of filmy grime. I noticed that some in the front were broken, as if he had a habit of getting his teeth knocked out in fights. He turned around, heading back into the kitchen in his strange, waddling gait. I wondered how Frank had gotten here. There was certainly no public transportation anywhere in this part of the state, but I figured he must have gotten dropped off. I looked down at my phone, hoping to find an open Wi-Fi connection to pass the time, but there was nothing here. Sighing, I looked around the restaurant. A creepy clown mannequin stood in the corner, holding a sign that read, "Be happy. Eat those feelings away." Its red and white makeup was all sharp points and heart angles. Around its grinning mouth, the red paint formed into a pointed half circle, accentuating the gleaming white teeth that shone between its thin lips. A few moments later, Frank came out, with a steaming hot cup of coffee and a bowl of creamers and sugar packets. He plopped them down in front of me, grunting and ambling back towards the kitchen. I smelled the odor of roasting meat and cooking oil rising from the kitchen in delicious, aromatic waves. I couldn't wait for my Reuben. Out of all sandwiches in the history of sandwiches, I thought Reubens were probably the most delicious. The way the corned beef mixed with the Thousand Island dressing, sauerkraut and marbled rye bread made it seem like those ingredients were made by God specifically to make such a divine sandwich. My stomach growled as I waited eagerly. I continued scanning the restaurant, listening to the hum of the TV next to me, when I spotted what looked like spatters of blood in front of the swinging kitchen doors. I used to work in a restaurant when I was a teenager, a crappy little pizza place, and I remember how the ground beef always came soaked in wet blood. I found it odd that no one had cleaned it up yet, though. It looked dry and clotted, as if it had been there for days. The TV was still talking about the escaped mental patients when Frank brought out a giant plate of delicious, fragrant sandwich and golden fries. I could feel my mouth watering as he laid it out with a clunk on the table in front of me. "Enjoy, buddy," he said, giving me a sly wink. His fish-like lips formed into a faint half-smile. He turned away, and I immediately dug in. The Reuben was probably the best Reuben I've ever tasted. The corned beef was perfectly cooked, the bread crisp and fresh. The fries were golden and had a nice, satisfying crunch. I wanted to compliment Frank, but he was nowhere to be seen. Shrugging, I finished the first half of my sandwich. As I got to the last bite, I noticed something odd and crunchy in the meat. I thought it was a coin or something at first. I immediately spit out the entire wad of half-chewed sandwich onto a napkin. Looking down, in the middle of the meat sat a painted human fingernail. It was ripped off, the bottom jagged and sharp. At that moment, I felt a sudden urge to vomit. I sat there for a few seconds, simply staring, my mind racing in circles like a rat in a wheel. Was it a fake fingernail? How had it gotten into my sandwich? I picked it up, bringing it closer to my right eye. I saw black, clotted blood, and thin strands of flesh still hanging from the bottom. It was definitely not fake. Rising quickly, I grabbed my car keys and phone off the table and started stumbling towards the door. There were no rational thoughts at that moment, just an insistent rising sense of panic and dread. That was the moment the lights at the diner cut out, and an eerie, gurgling laugh floated out of the kitchen. The cancerous yellow light of the new day was filtering through the stormy clouds. I looked through the plate glass front door and saw a face peering in with wide, insane eyes. I recognized the man I had dropped off at the Victorian house down the road. He had carved a fresh question mark into his forehead some time after I had last seen him. His face looked slack and empty as he stared inside his dead, blank eyes roaming left and right, looking for someone, looking for me. In his right hand, I saw an enormous meat cleaver streaked with fresh, dripping blood. He raised a trembling left hand and started opening the door. In the darkness and silence of the diner, I could hear every sound amplified 1,000-fold, every drop of rain hitting the roof, every thudding beat of my heart, every tiny creaking of the door as it swung open. I heard the doors to the kitchen swinging open at the same moment. In terror, I frantically looked around, seeing the bathrooms only a few feet away in the corner of the restaurant. As silently as I could, I slunk towards them, afraid to look back. I ripped open the women's restroom door, peeking out as I closed it behind me. I could see the man holding the meat cleaver slowly creeping past the tables, bending over to check underneath them. I could hear him whispering to himself. I must baptize them in the blood and send them out into the world, he muttered quietly. Must find the blood, eat the body, drink the blood to see God. Silently I closed the door and groped around in the dark until I found the lock. Inhaling deeply I clicked it to the side. The subtle clicking noise seemed as loud as a gunshot in the silence. I took my cell phone out of my pocket and turned, seeing a scene from a nightmare. Corpses littered the floor of the bathroom. A waitress in a button-up vest sat up against the wall in a corner. She looked to be in her mid-20s with dark brown eyes, black hair, and pale creamy skin. Dozens of deep stab wounds gleamed in her chest and stomach. Her neck had been so deeply slashed that her head had nearly been decapitated. Even worse, I saw chunks of flesh cut out of her body, chunks from the meat of her cheeks, arms, legs, and fingers. I suddenly had a very good idea of where the fingernail had come from and what I had been eating. I gagged, retching. Next to her sprawled the corpse of an old man in a business suit. His shirt and jacket had been ripped open, and a giant question mark carved deeply into the loose skin of his bird-like chest. Stuck in one eye I saw the gleam of a wicked butcher's knife. It had sliced the eye in half, the blade disappearing deeply into his brain and skull. The other eye stared glassily up at the ceiling. I heard a light tapping at the bathroom door, a kind of polite knocking that someone might use if they were wondering if it was occupied. I was afraid to breathe. I spun, looking at the wooden door, the only thing standing between me and certain death at this moment. Is anyone in there? A low raspy voice asked, the same voice that had mumbled about drinking blood. Occupado. Hey, what the fuck you doing? The gruff voice of Frank asked. Did you find him? His tone rose into one of utter excitement, like a child on his way to Disney World. The bathroom's locked? Reply. I think we got a little lamb in there ready for the slaughter. Ready for the grill, you mean? Frank said, giving an insane laugh that reminded me of the coldness of empty space. I turned, running over to the old man's corpse. The game was up. I knew. I wrapped my hands around the sticky, blood-coated handle of the butcher's knife. I started pulling up, but it was firmly implanted in the old man's skull. At that moment I heard a sound that sent waves of terror dancing up my spine. The sound of keys jingling in a lock. A rush of adrenaline made the world brighten and my vision turn white in the harsh glare of the phone's light. I laid the phone down on the top of the toilet and, with all of my strength, yanked up on the knife. There was a cracking noise, then a wet sucking sound as cold blood sprayed my face and neck. The knife slipped out in a rush, sending me flying back. At that moment, the door flew open. Frank and stood there, side by side, two grinning lunatics with knives in their hands. The orange light from the sunrise dimly illuminated their silhouettes. They looked over to where the cell phone lay on the toilet, not seeing me leaning against the back wall, breathing heavily in an animal panic. Before they had time to react, I ran forwards, the blade facing out towards my attackers. Turned towards me at the last second as I brought the knife into his throat. It sliced easily into the flesh. His eyes widened in pain and surprise as he gurgled, choking on his own blood. He tried to bring the meat cleaver up, but his foot slipped on the slick blood coating the floor. I yanked the knife back out, turning to Frank. I saw a flash of metal and felt something pierce deeply into the side of my stomach. A roaring pain like acid burned its way through my flesh, screaming as warm spurts of blood shot from the stab wound. I ran at Frank with the last of my energy, stabbing upwards into his belly and aiming at his aorta in the center. We fell into each other, both critically injured. The blood burst from his ruptured artery, spurting like a fire hose with each rapid beat of his heart. His eyes rolled up in his head as he fell back, landing on the corpse of Staggering and leaning against the wall, I tried making my way towards the front of the store, but felt the energy draining out of me like water through a sieve. Waves of agony crashed through my body, taking my breath away. I collapsed to my knees, crawling slowly towards salvation. Frothy bubbles of blood flowed over my lips as I coughed, choking. I heard sirens in the distance, approaching rapidly. It sounded like dozens of police cars were heading in our direction. Screaming and crying, I dragged myself towards the front door, leaving warm streaks of blood smeared across the restaurant floor. The gurgling death gasp of Frank rattled noisily behind me. I could feel my life draining out of the deep stab wound in the side of my stomach. As I reached the door, police cars came into the restaurant parking lot with a screeching of tires. Men began running out with their guns drawn. The world went black as I reached up towards the door, wanting only to get out of this restaurant and never see this town again. I woke up in the hospital a couple days later. Emergency surgery had stopped the bleeding, and many blood transfusions had saved my life. Police were waiting around my bed as I regained consciousness, frantic to ask me questions. I told them I didn't know anything, that I had just stopped at the restaurant to eat and gotten attacked. We had gotten multiple missing persons reports over the last couple weeks, the gruff homicide detective with a face like a bulldog said. But we didn't connect the victims to the diner until the day we found you there. Both of the escaped patients are dead though, thanks to you. He patted me on the shoulder. I shook my head too weary to respond. If only they had investigated sooner, I could have avoided this entire nightmare. But then again, I wouldn't have tasted the best Reuben sandwich in the universe either. Stories number 3. Last winter a blizzard arrived, and it brought something with it. I lived in a sheltered community that is owned by a company named The Community. It was a great place, although a little eerie at times. However, the sky is almost always gloomy. I'm not sure why this is happening. I really don't, but I've just learned to deal with it. Sometimes beams of sunshine break through. I'm an only child, and my parents were forced to move into the sheltered community due to budget cuts and the fact that it was very cheap. One day my parents decided to leave me at home while they went to work. I wasn't too upset about it. What teenager wouldn't? I got to sit at home, hang around, and watch TV. Now that my parents had left, I was left to my own devices. I've always considered the house to be creepy. It has an aura about it, something I couldn't explain. Every creak I heard in the house gave me goosebumps. Today was no different, however. I simply shrug it off and watch TV. A few hours later I was watching TV when I saw an emergency alert. The following message is being transmitted at the request of the community. Said the alert, "We are tracking the path of a devastating blizzard. Stay indoors and do not look outside. Do not open the door for anyone, even if they sound like your loved ones. Hide in a room without a window. Stay safe. And keep a radio with you to be alerted when it is safe to leave." I groaned and stood up, grabbed my phone. However, I then wondered why I couldn't look out the window. Perhaps debris. I assumed it was debris. I went into the closet and sat down. Now our closet was large enough to fit a few decently sized people. I began playing the waiting game. I looked up and saw an old record player and an envelope. I got up and grabbed the record player and envelope. I placed the record player on the floor. There was already a record in there. I pressed the on button and began playing the record. The music appeared to be that of a creepy nursery rhyme. The lyrics went as follows: "Beware the blizzard man. He's got a terrible plan. Children vanish, one by one. He melts them limb by limb. He mimics voices you know well, luring kids into his icy hell. In the snow where secrets lay, he takes their joy, their laughter away. So when the blizzard comes to town, stay inside. Don't make a sound. Close your eyes and count to 10. Pray he doesn't come again." Honestly, this nursery rhyme creeped me the hell out. Then I pulled open the envelope. I saw pictures of children having fun in the snow in the envelope, but there was a tall humanoid thing in the background of these photos watching. Its entire body was black and it appeared to be wearing a white mask. I was unable to figure out if it had a cloak on or if that was its actual body. Was this the blizzard man? I began to think rationally. Maybe it was the set of some horror movie, and this nursery rhyme was made for it. However, I heard a knock on the front door. I stood up and left the closet, headed for the front door. I walked towards the front door and heard my mom's voice. "Sweetie, I left my keys inside the house. Can I come in?" asked my mom. I walked forward, preparing to let her in, but then I realized something. My mom took the keys when she left. I could feel my stomach drop. "Sweetie, can you let me in?" my mom asked, her voice sounding like a recording being played back. Mom, you took the keys with you, remember?" I asked. Whatever was outside began banging on the door. "Let me in, brat," yelled whatever was outside, still using my mom's voice. I stepped back, hyperventilating. I dashed to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, intending to protect myself. Whatever was outside was banging so violently on the door that I feared it may come off its hinges at any moment. It stopped and I thought it had left me alone. However, that is when I heard a knock on the window behind me. "Let me in," said the thing. I swallowed, drew up the curtains and screamed. The thing stood on the other side of the window, his face pressed up against the glass. It appeared to be wearing a melted mask with hollow eyes glaring at me. It was still using my mom's voice. "Let me in," it said. I grabbed my phone and began dialing 911. However, I had no signal. The thing seemed to chuckle, although I couldn't hear it. It then began banging on the glass. The glass started to crack. I stepped back, dropped my knife and ran. I could hear the glass shatter behind me and whatever the thing was, stepping into the kitchen. I ran from my room and hid beneath the bed. I could hear the thing opening and closing closets. It then entered my room. It started taunting me. It came to stop near my bed, crouched down, and we locked eyes. I screamed, shimmying backward until my back was against the wall. The thing started to reach for me. I looked around, before noticing a bat under my bed. I grabbed the bat and swung it at the thing's face. It recoiled, and I took the opportunity to run. The blizzard had passed, so I left the house. I ran to a neighbor's house and banged on the door. They opened up and welcomed me in. I was safe. I could breathe a sigh of relief. That incident was a few months ago. My parents never came back. I left the sheltered community to go live with my grandparents. Before I left, I took some VHS tapes and SD cards from the house and brought them with me. I could use them to figure out what happened to the person who lived before me. This was one of the scariest experiences I've had. I don't know what happened to my parents, or what the thing really wants. However, I know what it's capable of. Stories number 4. I won't be going back into the woods near my house. Here is my recollection of some events that transpired in the woods near my house when I was a kid back in 5th or 6th grade. It seems around the time after it happened, my brain sort of forced me to forget exactly when it all transpired. You could relate it to when you experience some trauma as a kid and your brain tries to make you forget. Going back to type this as I forgot before. But this all happened in southeastern US and in the springtime, so imagine that classic southeastern forest look for our woods. So first of all, I apologize in advance, as I'm not a good writer. I think my best work was my 11th grade English paper on And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. It was my favorite book I had to read, but I digress. To start, this story involves myself and my neighbor, who is also my best friend, still to this day. As to not out either of us, he'll refer to him as our and I would spend lots of time in the woods together, exploring, mapping out the woods and playing airsoft. I can't lie, the woods were the perfect place to play airsoft, as there were two dried up creek beds opposing each other about 100 yards between them, which made for great bunkers. There were two entrances to the woods, imagined to parallel streets of houses going down a hill, and at the bottom there were two cul-de-sacs, each with its own entrance to the woods. The right side street, which was inconveniently not the street we lived on, had the entrance to woods closest to the airsoft area and where we mainly explored. The entrance to the woods on our street was a little harder to access, and required us to make bigger jumps across the creek to get to and from. We had barely explored on that side since we never really found anything cool, old tree forts, etc. But one day my dad and I were clearing out some of his old ARMY gear from a rock, kinda sorting through what he wanted to give to me, keep, and get rid of. So after that I ended up with a Shemaganda tritium compass. After receiving that compass, 12-ish-year-old me apparently had a newfound love for cartography, and I wanted to map the woods with the help of R, of course. So we started out mapping the right area of the woods, the two trenches where we spent our time airsofting, building forts, and trying to jump as far as possible across the creek. Even though it was a poor map pen, I could spend 2 minutes on Google Earth and printed out something much better to start with. I was proud of it. So time passed 10, we kept adding to the map pan, moving further and further left to the woods, just about in line with the cul-de-sac of our street. We went about 1/8 of a mile further left, which for simplicity's sake is south. Then we started west, which would be further into the woods. We passed a couple of poorly constructed bridges made by other kids our age and hopped across the creek and kept going on and on and on. It started to get dark in the woods about 30 to 45 minutes after we started our trek, so we decided to head back home. As previously stated, there was nothing of interest out that way in the woods, so it was hard to establish a good po beside certain jumps we had to make over the creek. But either way, we clearly knew the route we took and where it led. We just kept following the creek west. As it turns out, time is pretty linear, and 30 minutes later we end up back at the entrance to the woods at our cul-de-sac. So we split ways, headed back to our houses, and called it a night. A couple days later I decided to look on Google Earth and saw that if we had gone just a little bit further we would have ended up at a main road. The thought of venturing that far sounded cool to me, so relayed the newfound info over to her, and he agreed it would be a good goal to try and reach the main road. Not long after this we were able to meet up again around the same time of day as we had before, and start back into the woods, unfortunately with a much different outcome. Our trek into the woods started like normal, jumping over the creek at the same places, retracing our steps and following the compass directly west as we had before. We were around 20 minutes into our little expedition and couldn't contain our excitement of where we would end up. We jumped over the creek at the same spots and passed the same poorly constructed bridges that we passed before we turned back the first time. 40 minutes in we were starting to get a little worn out and definitely discouraged that we hadn't found the main road yet, but assumed we had just been slower than we were previously, so we persisted, still following our compass directly west. I apologize again for my poor writing skills, and I will try my best to explain everything as best as I can. If I remember right, a little over an hour had passed 10, we still hadn't found the road, so we decided to stop where we were and try and familiarize ourselves with our surroundings in case we had gotten turned around, even though we had followed the compass perfectly. After assuming we had to be less than 10 minutes away from the road, we carried on again, but just minutes in we found ourselves surrounded by what I now know are aspen trees, and if you know anything about trees, which I didn't, aspen trees are not native to the southeast. It's like the scenery had changed in an instant, and looking around everything was different. Aspen trees in every direction, and what's even more odd, the leaves were a reddish yellow fall color, not what you would see in springtime. We were kids and were none the wiser, so we persisted, and eventually found ourselves facing a pond. But it wasn't a normal pond, it was perfectly level with the ground we were standing on, no discernible bank or edge to it. It just meshed perfectly with the earth. It was covered with the red yellow leaves. The outline of the water between the leaves was completely black, and the water was still, like it had never been disturbed. I remember touching the toe of my shoe into the water to try and find the bottom, and move the leaves out of the way. The leaves moved, but the surface tension of the water never broke, the stillness unfaltering, as the outline of the water had hinted at before. The water was truly black, like that new super black paint you've seen on social media, and I could see no bottom. It wasn't long after this I started feeling uneasy. Something just didn't seem as it should. Our must had the same feeling as he said to me that he felt as if something was watching us, which didn't help to calm my nerves whatsoever. We both began to take a second and observe our surroundings more carefully, and my best description of the sky was a pure white, like paper white, no sky blue and no clouds. Just a complete paper white visible through the remaining leaves on the trees. Then out of nowhere we heard the supersonic crack of what you normally relate to gunfire. But it didn't subside immediately after like it normally would. It persisted, a constant noise louder than we could bear, a constant pressure on our heads. We knew we needed to run. I pulled out the compass once more, found east and darted in that direction, pushing through the brush of the woods, and within 30 seconds we were back in the normal southeastern woodland. But that didn't matter. We ran as fast as our legs could take us. I remember getting caught on some brambles, and the dread that swept over me was immense. It felt as if the brambles were keeping me from freedom, and being caught for any longer would ensure my death. I eventually managed to break free, and upon looking up, after freeing myself, we were in very familiar territory. Right in front of one of the jumps over the creek we had made not even 5 minutes into our trip. Somehow we outran what previously took up over an hour in just minutes. We made our way out of the woods and up the street to our houses. Not saying a word. It was years later we brought it up to each other and had almost the exact same recollection of events. Except where I saw a plain white sky, or saw the same white sky, but after hearing the deafening noise, saw that the sky opened with hundreds of eyes all blinking. I can't confirm this, as I didn't see it myself, but nor was I looking at the sky after the nose rang out. What inspired me to write about this is I came across a photo on the internet of what I now know as aspen trees, and sent it to R, even more years after we spoke about what happened. I sent no caption, no explanation to the picture, to see if he truly remembered the same thing as I. He responded, "I remember." Stories number 5, A Candle in the Dark. Ever since I could remember myself, I was a cowardly person. Or, to formulate it in a lighter tone, I am prone to be scared. Living in a rural area with few kids around my age to play with, we all knew each other in the town, and our families were either relatives or friends. My childhood friends had noticed my fidgeting when we would go to darker places, the quickening of my breaths when entering an abandoned townhouse, or when going to the farms late at night to play hide and seek. While they picked on me from time to time, they didn't give me a hard time about it. They understood also that the world is dangerous enough, so having one person in your group who is too careful, keep the careless people in line. I was very good in games, throwing stones with precision on target cans, chasing, dodgeball. However, I was exceptionally good at hide and seek, and, being a scrawny little dude, was easy for me to fit in unlikely places. During the day I would go exploring on my own, and, at night, I knew where the best hiding spots were that were not too dark or far from an inhabited house. Yet I could feel the fear once in a while. A sudden gust of wind whistling through broken branches would be enough to make me very scared. When I was around 8, I told my parents about my fear of the dark. They initially told me that I think too much of it, but as the months went by and they saw my everyday efforts to avoid dark corners, and always having the lights turned on in my room, they grew concerned. They asked me on whether I had a negative experience in my past while being in the dark. I didn't. I always had this fear that, in the dark, no one is truly alone. That something is there always, waiting to drop my guard. My grandmother, who happened to be in the house during this conversation, she was looking at me concerned and, at the same time, nodding at me, as in a way to tell me that my concerns were valid. In the following years, I put a lot of effort in my academics and fitness. I signed up to a couple of self-defense classes that boosted my confidence in myself, although I still remained thin and short. This fear of the dark, well, it lessened. It never vanished even when I finished high school, and was about to study a college a bit too far from my homely town. My grandmother, bless her soul, had visited us that fateful morning when I was preparing to move to the uni dorms. She asked my parents that she wanted to talk to me in private, and, while initially surprised, they did as she asked and went to carry my stuff in their car. "My beau," she said with a calm tone, her brown eyes losing their usual joyful gleam. "Living alone in a dark, cold city is different. I worked in that city and other cities for many years to bring food on the table. Your dear grandfather also was a hard-working man. He taught me how to protect myself. I never needed to use what he taught me. But he also knew that there was one more thing that made me scared." Yes, she admitted as I looked at her surprised. "The dark," she continued, as I didn't interrupt her, "has always been a fear for me. I never had anything bad happen to me in it, but it always made me wary. You know how some stories go. Demons, ghouls, ghosts, etc. We often hear that the true monster under the bed is human. But what if it actually isn't?" I nodded at her, my hands trembling a bit. Even going to a psychologist for this didn't help. Session after session, my fears got little, yet they still are there. She nodded at that. She gently took my trembling hands in hers. She was trembling a bit too. "Maybe I have an issue, or a curse, that I passed it down on you, my darling Lucas. We all have problems. However, a few years ago, when your grandfather was in his deathbed for over 2 weeks, He told me to keep the lights open when it was night, every single night. He never liked to have them on next to his bed, which is why I had a night lamp always on my side of the bed and not his. Right there though, in that hospital room, he asked me that. I did so. He then told me he could sometimes see shadows in the hospital. And sometimes, those shadows didn't neither natural nor friendly. Before he passed away, he gave me this cross to wear around my neck. It was a gift from his godfather. He told me, even during the war, that cross was his candle in the dark. He never took it off and he always felt that it gave him courage. She opened her woven bag and took the cross out. I inclined my head, understanding. She wore it on my neck and kissed the top of my head. Ever since I wore this cross, I felt more at ease when it would be dark. I stopped using my lamp from time to time. The fear was still there yet. I felt as if your grandfather was next to me, guarding me against whatever was lurking behind the dark curtain of the night. May it be your candle now, a small reminder that dawn always comes even after the darkest of nights. I thanked her profusely and we shed tears of farewell. I love her a lot and now I know one more reason why. She understood me completely. It wasn't easy getting used to the city life. Working part-time at a bakery and hustling through my engineering degree was taxing on my body. Yet, I had two cool roommates at the dorm, and we kept each other good company in and out of the dorms. I was on one hand, way of my surroundings, especially late at night when I could return home from a party. But I never got rid of my need for exploration. So I knew which routes and shortcuts to use at night because I had already explored them during the day. One such route, however, was next to an abandoned, soon-to-be-demolished hotel. Well, it was open for visitation as a soon-to-be-demolished historical landmark. That place gave me the chills since the first time I laid my eyes upon it. It had a very creepy vibe, the same type of vibe I felt towards darkness. Only this place made me feel actually nauseous when I was near it, as if something or someone really dangerous was lurking in its shadows of the night. I tried to explore it during the day, to face my fear within its dusty beige and flowery decorated walls that started to smell of mold. Yet, that place was making me feel pure dread, even during the day. Its basement was the creepiest place I had visited in my life. Even during the hours of the day, I felt pure fear just being in there. In its gray walls and emptiness, I could feel a resounding presence. What also didn't help were the local news, which were reporting disappearances of people every couple of months near that area. Since I heard those news, I never went to explore that building again. I even bought a pepper spray can, just in case, when I had to go even remotely near that place. It was right in the middle of my quickest route back home from the city center. Every night, I used a different route to go home after a party. Every night. Not that night 2 months ago. Because that was when I met some monsters. It was a Friday night. The third-year engineering students at uni made a collab party with the philosophy third years. It was an interesting party and people really hit it off. My roommates, Josh and Chris, were also there, dancing and meeting new people. I was there just for the vibes. I had the next morning off at the bakery, so I just wanted to drink a couple of beers and chill. It was almost summer and we had no written exams except for written projects, so it was all good. I decided to stroll back home at around 2:30 a.m. My mates wanted to stay more, so I wished them a good time and went back on my own. It wasn't the first time I did that and I never encountered problematic strangers on the way home. Not this night. I was halfway through on one of the paths I was using to go home. This path was dimly lit by a couple of street lights. Not many houses were around, only some shops that were closed for the night. I saw from afar 3 large-looking men nudging a person between them. When I took a closer look, I felt terror in the pit of my stomach. That person was a young woman, no older than me. Under the street lamp, I could see that her hair were a mess and something was trickling down from the mouth. Blood. One of those brutes were choking her strong enough to make her not scream for help. I was frozen stiff in fear. Quickly, I moved to the side, behind another street lamp. I sent my GPS coordinates to my mates and told them to call the police right now. Thankfully, they saw my message instantly. I then took pictures and a short video, showing how they were dragging the poor woman with them, and I sent them to my friends. While I was about to call the police myself, I stood appalled and terrified at what I was witnessing. She was putting up a fight and at one point, one of them punched her in the face. That's what took me out of my terrified state. That woman was suffering and God knows what else those assholes would do to her. I couldn't rely solely on the police. Friday nights were the worst. The police department would have their hands full of burglaries and other crimes. It would take them at least 10 minutes to respond and that might be too late for her. So, I looked around me and saw some large stones. I put some in my pockets and threw the largest one at the direction of the men. It hit the arm of one of them with a loud noise. As he turned around to see what was that, I threw another one that hit him square on his temple and he dropped on the pavement, unconscious. Come take on someone your size, I shouted as I threw one stone after another at the other two, hitting him in the shoulder. I was good at aiming. Too many games of dodgeball taught me how to be accurate with my throws. The two assholes dropped the woman like a sack of potatoes on the ground and raced straight at me. I felt the adrenaline hit me and, before I realized it, I was running full speed, away from them, while glancing back and throwing them more stones. They were screaming in anger as they were approaching me, but I was speeding up. I could feel the vibrations in right pocket from my phone, but I couldn't answer right now. They were gaining on me, so I turned abruptly to my left and used a different path. That path was leading near where the woman was lying and the third man was still down. I ran and saw that the young woman wasn't there anymore, but the man was still on the ground. She escaped, I thought with glee, as I ran in a route ahead of me. At one point though, I saw only one of them behind me. Oh crap. I then realized I was in the lot where that damn hotel was, and it had two ways out. If one of them was right behind me, the other was right across me. The lot had no other ways out. It was like a cage because of smaller demolitions that needed to be done in some service buildings right outside the hotel. I looked at the threatening figures gaining on me. I froze for a second. I could escape them by entering the hotel and exiting via the doorway in its basement. Yet I knew something dreadful was in there, in that basement. Yet I thought, if something dreadful was in there, I shouldn't be afraid, not now. I needed to be strong. I lunged towards the hotel's entrance, my sudden change of course disorienting my pursuers. They soon followed after me. I was faster than them now in the dark. Under the dim city lights, I could see quite clearly in front of me. I followed the dusty corridor to my right and went down the only set of stairs leading to the basement. That's when I felt it. That's when I knew. Someone was in here, in the almost complete darkness of the basement. The only light that was entering was from the almost closed exit door. No windows, no lamps. When I ran towards the door on the right side of the basement, my feelings of dread and panic multiplied. There was a lock and chain on the door. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I felt the darkness around me like a thick blanket ready to strangle me, while also hearing footsteps on the floor above. The assholes were coming down here. In that moment, I felt as if my life passed in front of me. There was no way out other than those stairs. If I tried to use them now, there was a high chance they would get me while they would come down here. And if they got me, I was a dead man. I knew it. I felt my grandmother's cross over my beating heart. I wasn't alone. I felt a soft feeling of relief and bravery engulfing my trembling limbs. I took a deep breath and, in the pitch-black darkness, the city lights showed me a bunch of desks and chairs towards the left corner of the large room. Those weren't here 2 years ago. I ran towards them, despite an alarming feeling of fear that hit me, when I looked towards the dark, left corner. I hid in between some of them offices. They were large and heavy desks and I found a small nook between two of the ones further to the front to hide in it. People in hide and seek always look for the furthest, darkest corners, not the upfront, obvious hiding places. I held my breath. I then took deep breaths to calm myself down. Beads of sweat fell on my forehead. My shirt was drenched. I felt the ground beneath me and felt something like a heavy brick. I took it in my right hand. If they were to find me or catch me while running away, I wouldn't go down without a fight. I took my phone out, texted my location to my friends, but I had no signal. Damn it. I checked my other pocket. I had a couple of stones left. Maybe I could use them to distract them. The steps got closer to the stairs. I breathed shakily, then slowly, then silently. My heart was pumping in terror as I saw the two men enter the basement. In that moment, my vision got darker. As if the darkness in the basement was thicker, heavier. I felt the cross on my chest become heavy and warm. I raised my left hand and, to my amazement and horror, I felt that the cross was almost too hot to hold. Something was very wrong in this place. The men entered the basement. One of them was lighting up the place and checking the desks one by one, while the other was guarding the stairs. I didn't think that far. They did. If they find me. The cross was now burning in my grasp, but I didn't let go. I was suddenly feeling all my senses to scream at me to run away from something infinitely more terrible than those two monsters. "Come out, you piece of shit," the dude in front of the stairs shouted. Gasping for air, "We will find you and we will have our sweet time taking turns beating you up. Little punk." His voice was deep and was threatening, but it didn't matter. I wanted to shout at them to run away. I didn't know what it was. I looked through the small crack in front of me. I froze. My limbs felt suddenly paralyzed. On the left corner of the room, from where I was standing close to a few minutes ago, was a figure. It was tall, abnormally tall. It was wearing a top hat and a tux, yet I couldn't see arms from the sleeves. It had its back towards the room. But I felt it. It wasn't human. Whoa, I heard the dude standing in front of the stairs when his phone's light centered on that figure. His buddy also audibly gasped. Who the fuck is that? One of them asked, and the other just shrugged his shoulders. The rooms felt darker and darker by the second. The light from their phones started to flicker. Sir, we are looking for a scrawny-ass punk. He is our friend. Is he a friend like that woman you were planning to have your way with a few minutes ago? My body now was completely numb. My hand was on my cross and I felt it burn. It was the only thing that reminded me that this was real. That male voice was smooth, almost intoxicating to listen to. But it also felt as if it was a guttural growl from a beast. Or that poor old couple you killed 2 weeks ago. Or that young father you found near your turret and shot on the back. Should I go on? The two dudes looked suddenly terrified. One of them pulled a gun out of his pocket. Who the fuck are you? The figure slowly turned, and that's when I screamed. There was unending darkness, no zampy sockets for eyes, except for an alarming gleam reminiscent of the light of a hunter's moon. The nose was abnormally big and sharp, the face of the skin gray, wrinkled and decaying, and its mouth was terrifyingly wide, with countless black teeth forming a horrific smile that was pointed towards me. The men gasped loudly, one dropping his phone, the other looking towards my direction and then towards that thing. In the last flicker of his phone's light, the figure disappeared from the corner and appeared in front of the two now terrified men. As they started screaming and shooting at it, I saw that thing's upper limbs exiting the tux's sleeves, bony and black, from rotten flesh, piercing the head of the dude with the gun. It then tore off the head and threw it to the side, while its mouth took a bite from the headless corpse's neck. The other man screamed bloody murder, but the beast pierced his chest with its limbs and dragging him towards it. Muffled screams and blood gurgling and bone crunching were the only sounds in the basement. The screams were soon gone. The gurgling was gone. The bones crunching sounds disappeared. That thing ate both of them, and I saw it all, under the dimness of the city lights from the basement store and under the flickering of their phones' torches. Not even the bones remained, not even a drop of blood. I was trembling in fear, tears coming down my eyes. I was next. The figure stood. It looked at me, those horrific eyes piercing my own. I felt it hated me in that moment. That thing wanted to tear me to pieces. In an enraged voice, stripped from all the smoothness and the inviting tone of before, that thing growled, "If it wasn't for that thing you have around your neck, I have you for dessert." The figure disappeared in a black smog. I don't know how long I was in that nook. I don't know how many hours of shock my brain tried to process. It was way after 6 a.m. that I saw the light of dawn piercing through the basement door. I mustered the courage to crawl out of my hiding spot. I stood up, my mind hazy and dizzy, my limbs trembling from weakness and tiredness. I approached the stairs, not daring to look to my left. Not even a drop of blood was there, only their dropped, crushed phones. Their torches were still on. I left them there. I looked behind me, towards that corner. I could feel it was there, now invisible under the light of day, but waiting. Goodbye, Lucas. I felt terror again in my heart. It knew my name. I ran as fast as I could up the stairs, not looking back. I ran and ran and ran, until I reached in front of my dorms. I entered my room and my friends were there. They looked at me relieved and came to hug me. I hugged them back, crying harder than I ever did before. The terror gave its place in overwhelming relief. I don't remember how I got into the shower and then went to the police station to give a testimony of the events. I met the woman who was assaulted at the police station. Thankfully, she wasn't severely injured by those brutes and she was already treated at the hospital. When she saw me, she rushed to come close to me and hugged me, thanking me for helping her. She had managed to run away to a nearby pub and soon after, she contacted also the police. The police had already arrived on the spot where my friends had instructed them to go, based on the coordinates I sent to them in that message. They arrested that man after I left the basement and my phone gained signal. My friends sent them the coordinates of the hotel that they had just received. They also checked the hotel, except for the phones. They found nothing from the other two criminals. I knew though, as I recounted with the woman and the police the events of that night, I knew what happened to those two. Yet I didn't say anything about what that thing did to them. No one would believe me. Those men were wannabe monsters who met their end by the hands of an actual monster. I am now in my room, the lights turned on. Every whistle of the wind outside makes me flinch and look around. Every shadow I see in the corners makes me terrified. I still remember those hollow, dark eyes with that horrible orange gleam. I don't know if I ever feel okay, but suddenly, I reminded myself. I looked at my left palm. The burnt imprint of my grandmother's cross was there, the only reminder of the reality of what happened. And the reminder that in my hour of need, in that thick, murderous darkness, I wasn't alone. I touched the cross over my chest, my candle in the dark. I pulled it towards my temple and, for the first time in my life, I prayed. I prayed in gratitude. I was alive. That woman was alive. The 2 criminals were dead. The 3rd was behind bars. That the monster was in that basement, lurking, waiting for its next victim. I just hope that, when that building is demolished, that thing will stay in the shadows under the rubbles, forever.